The first city fell apart without realizing it was being watched. A riot escalated into a massacre in under 6 minutes. Sups overreacted. Police pulled back. Cameras kept rolling long after help stopped coming. From above the chaos, floating just beyond perception, a tall figure with silver hair and a staff observed calmly, expression unchanged. Whis did not flinch when bodies hit the ground. He did not move when a building collapsed sideways into a crowd. He did not speak when Homelander arrived late, furious, desperate to reassert control over a scene that had already slipped past him. Homelander felt it then, that sensation of being categorized, not challenged. He lashed out, screaming at the sky, demanding something to respond. Nothing did. Whis smiled softly, eyes distant, as if confirming a hypothesis he already understood. This universe wasn't spiraling because of villains or heroes. It was spiraling because no one was coming to stop it anymore. And far worse than judgment had begun. Observation. You're not watching a rescue story. You're watching what happens when no one intervenes. Subscribe once, because what Whis observes next won't be stopped, slowed, or undone, and missing it means missing where this universe truly breaks. No alarm sounded when Whis arrived. There was no rupture in the sky, no flash of light, no measurable energy spike for satellites to misinterpret as a weapons test. One moment the air above the Atlantic was empty, and the next it was. Whis stood there effortlessly, staff resting in one hand, posture relaxed, as if he had always belonged in that space and reality was only now catching up. Below him, the world continued exactly as it always had. A Vought-sponsored rally was underway on the East Coast. Tens of thousands gathered beneath banners promising safety, strength, and heroes who cared. Homelander's face stretched across massive screens, pre-recorded smiles looping on command. Security was tight, optics carefully managed. Nothing about the event suggested instability. Whis watched quietly. He did not look impressed. He did not look disappointed. His expression carried the same gentle neutrality he wore everywhere, pleasant, distant, and deeply unsettling once noticed. The first deviation occurred 37 minutes later. A low-level supe in the crowd panicked after being jostled. His ability, localized kinetic bursts, was supposed to be regulated, dampened by medication. It was. One misfire cracked pavement. A second sent bodies flying. Screams rippled outward faster than the shockwave. Whis tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging a familiar pattern. Security reacted poorly. Vought-trained responders escalated force instead of isolating the threat. Cameras swung toward chaos, not containment. A second supe intervened without coordination. Then a third. What should have been a controlled incident became a cascading failure, each reaction amplifying the next. From above, it looked less like an accident and more like a system revealing its seams. Whis made no move to stop it. Homelander arrived late, streaking in with practiced fury. He hovered above the wreckage, cape snapping, voice booming as he barked orders that came too late to matter. His presence still silenced crowds. It still imposed fear. But not order. As medics rushed in and fires burned unchecked, Homelander felt something wrong. Not a threat, not resistance, something closer to being evaluated. His eyes scanned the sky instinctively, jaw tightening. He saw nothing. Whis remained just outside the threshold of perception, not invisible, simply unimportant to the mechanisms Homelander relied on to define danger. Vought's internal systems flagged the incident as a manageable PR event. Analysts pulled engagement metrics even as casualty numbers climbed. Narrative teams drafted statements before damage assessments were complete. The machine moved the way it always had, efficiently, confidently, and incorrectly. Whis observed all of it. He drifted from the rally to a nearby hospital where victims overwhelmed emergency staff. He noted response times, resource shortages. The precise moment administrators chose legal protection over patient care. When a generator failed during surgery, Whis watched the surgeon freeze, then continue anyway. The patient did not survive. Whis smiled faintly. Across the city, the boys felt the shift before they understood it. Butcher stood on a rooftop overlooking the smoke, jaw clenched, cigarette forgotten between his fingers. Something about the chaos felt different. Not worse, uncontained. Like the usual pressure keeping things from spiraling had been quietly removed. Huey couldn't explain the unease crawling up his spine. He kept glancing upward, half expecting something to be there. Ran scenario after scenario in his head and discarded all of them. Frenchie muttered about bad omens. Kimiko watched silently, eyes narrowed, sensing absence more than presence. None of them saw Whis. Later that night, a second incident unfolded halfway across the world. A covert Vought black site test went wrong when a soup's regenerative factor failed to trigger on schedule. Internal footage showed confusion, then panic, then quiet compliance as executives ordered the site sealed with personnel still inside. Whis arrived as the doors locked. He walked through the walls as if they weren't there, observing technicians banging on reinforced glass, documenting reactions without recording devices. He did not intervene when oxygen levels dropped. He did not look away when the screaming stopped. When the site finally went silent, Whis marked the outcome with a nod. Homelander dreamed that night, not of defeat, not of death. He dreamed of standing on a stage, lights blazing, audience roaring, until the applause faded without warning. He stood alone, smiling too long, waiting for something to respond. Nothing did. He woke furious, heart racing, convinced someone had seen him fail. By morning, Vought stock dipped unexpectedly. No scandal, no leak, just a subtle loss of confidence analysts couldn't explain. Executives dismissed it as market noise. They would regret that assumption later. High above, Whis finally paused his movement. He gazed out over the planet, staff tapping lightly against nothing, expression serene. The data was already accumulating, patterns repeating, outcomes aligning exactly as expected. This universe didn't need correction. It needed to be observed all the way through. And somewhere deep in the structure of reality, something irreversible had already begun. The second collapse didn't look like a disaster. That was the problem. No explosions marked it. No crowd screamed. No footage went viral in the first hour. Instead, it arrived quietly, in decisions made behind glass walls and closed doors, in systems hesitating where they once reacted automatically. At Vought Tower, an internal briefing stalled halfway through its opening slide. Executives sat around the table, eyes fixed on a set of projections that refused to stabilize. Risk models contradicted one another. Probability trees looped back on themselves. Every scenario that assumed intervention, heroic, military, or corporate, returned incomplete. Someone cleared their throat and suggested a recalibration. No one argued, no one approved it either. That silence stretched just a second too long. Whis observed from the corner of the room, leaning lightly on his staff, invisible to the eyes scanning spreadsheets and panic indicators. His gaze moved from face to face, not judging, not disappointed, simply confirming behavioral drift under uncertainty. When the meeting adjourned without resolution, Whis smiled. Across the city, Homelander felt the hesitation ripple outward. He stood before a mirror in one of Vaught's private suites, hands gripping the sink hard enough to fracture porcelain. His reflection stared back, flawless and furious, but something was wrong. The certainty he relied on, his ability to end moments by entering them, felt thinner. He hadn't been summoned that morning. That had never happened before. Homelander stormed through the corridors, cape trailing, demanding updates that arrived half-formed and late. PR teams spoke in conditional language. Analysts avoided eye contact. Even Ashley, usually frantic to appease him, paused before responding. That pause lingered. Homelander didn't understand it, but he felt it the same way prey senses a shift in the forest before seeing the predator. Someone, or something, was present without acting, watching without responding. He scanned the air again, nostrils flaring. Nothing. Whis drifted through the city streets below, passing unnoticed between people who suddenly felt compelled to slow down, to look over their shoulders, to double-check assumptions that had guided them for years. Sups hesitated before intervening in crimes they would have charged into days earlier. Police waited for confirmation that never came. In one alley, a mugging turned lethal because no one stepped in quickly enough. In another, a soup walked away from a burning car because the situation felt unclear. Whis cataloged each moment. The boys noticed the shift from the opposite angle. Butcher watched footage roll in from multiple sources, jaw tight. It wasn't the violence that bothered him. Violence was expected. It was the delay, response time stretching, decision-making stalling, systems that usually covered for their own failures suddenly exposed. "This ain't panic," he muttered, "it's hesitation." Huey frowned, scrolling through reports, like everyone, waiting for someone else to go first. MM nodded slowly, or waiting for permission. They all felt it then, the absence of pressure where there should have been resistance, as if the world had lost its reflexes. Kimiko looked toward the window, eyes narrowed, sensing something none of them could name. High above them, Whis watched the realization form and pass without anchoring. He did not engage. He did not confirm. Later that evening, a Vought Black Op team executed a containment mission in Eastern Europe. The target, a rogue soup whose power destabilized infrastructure simply by existing. Protocol dictated immediate neutralization. Instead, the team paused. Orders came down scrambled, revised twice mid-transmission. Legal flagged liability. PR requested confirmation footage. By the time approval arrived, the soup had moved. An entire city block lost power. Hospitals went dark. Whis arrived as emergency generators failed, noting how long it took for leadership to accept responsibility. He stood beside a field commander frozen between action and authorization, listening as the man whispered, "I don't know what to do," to no one in particular. Whis said nothing. Homelander arrived hours later, rage simmering, cameras hastily repositioned to frame him as decisive. He shouted. He threatened. He overperformed strength to compensate for something slipping through his grasp. But even as buildings steadied under his presence, the crowd's response felt different. Less awe, more relief that something had finally happened. That difference terrified him. For the first time, Homelander wondered briefly, involuntarily, what would happen if no one came at all. He pushed the thought away violently. That night, Vaught's internal AI flagged an anomaly it could not classify. A non-hostile presence registered across multiple locations without leaving energy signatures. The system labeled it observer bias and archived the data. Whis noticed the classification and approved of it. On the rooftop of Vought Tower, as the city pulsed below in uneven rhythms of fear and delay, Whis finally stopped moving. He gazed across the skyline, staff glowing faintly in response to nothing visible. This phase was always the quietest. The moment when intervention was still possible, but no longer expected. The universe was learning how it behaved when no one corrected its mistakes. And below, Homelander stared out over the city he once controlled by presence alone, realizing that something had changed the rules without touching a single piece. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was spreading. Vought International did what it always did when faced with something it couldn't control. It tried to quantify it. The internal directive didn't come from the top, not officially. It emerged quietly, threaded through analytics teams, R&D departments, and predictive modeling divisions under neutral language like environmental anomaly review and non-hostile variable assessment. No one said Whis' name. Most of them didn't know there was a name to say. They only knew the models were failing. In a secured sublevel beneath Vought Tower, analysts stared at screens layered with overlapping datasets, crime response times, soup engagement delays, civilian casualty curves. Individually, the numbers made sense. Together, they formed patterns that refused interpretation. Correlation without cause. Presence without action. One senior data scientist finally said it out loud. It's like something skewing behavior just by being there. The room went quiet. That phrase was flagged and removed from the transcript before the meeting ended. Vought's first mistake was assuming passivity meant accessibility. If the anomaly wasn't attacking, then it could be studied. If it could be studied, it could be predicted. And if it could be predicted, it could be neutralized or at least framed. A surveillance sweep was authorized. Satellites recalibrated. Thermal sensors widened parameters. Quantum noise filters were loosened far beyond safe thresholds. Vought didn't notice the irony of using increasingly unstable systems to find something defined by stability. Whis noticed. He drifted through the operations center as the equipment spun itself into contradiction, every advanced instrument attempting to isolate him and failing in a different way. Some sensors showed nothing at all. Others showed him everywhere at once. One briefly identified him as a temporal artifact before crashing entirely. Whis smiled politely at the chaos. A junior analyst panicked and tried to reboot the entire array manually. Power surged. Screens went black. Backup systems kicked in seconds too late. Vought recorded the incident as a hardware fault. Across the building, Homelander felt the surge like a spike behind his eyes. He landed hard on a balcony overlooking the city, boots cracking concrete, breath sharp. For a split second, he thought he'd lost altitude control. That had never happened before. His powers responded instantly, but the doubt lingered longer than the sensation itself. He scanned the skyline again. Still nothing. "What the hell are you?" he muttered, not realizing he was speaking to an absence. Vought's second mistake was assuming observation meant ignorance. A cross-department task force was assembled: behavioral psychology, metaphysics consultants, retired military analysts. They built profiles based on what the anomaly hadn't done. No intervention. No communication. No visible preference. That suggests limitation, one consultant argued. Rules, boundaries. Whis listened as the hypothesis took shape and collapse folded neatly into the next slide. They proposed tests. Nothing aggressive, just stimuli, controlled disruptions to see if the presence reacted. A low-level soup was deployed into a high-risk zone without backup. Another was instructed to escalate force publicly beyond protocol. In a third location, Vought deliberately delayed emergency response to create a cascade event. The results were consistent. Nothing happened. No correction, no interruption, no punishment. The absence of response unnerved them more than retaliation ever could have. Hospitals overflowed. Public outrage spiked. Stock prices dipped and stabilized again under carefully edited statements. Vought told itself this was manageable. Whis stood at the edge of one of those disasters, watching medics triage without enough resources, watching civilians realize help was not coming quickly anymore. He did not step in. He did not avert his eyes. This was observation, not cruelty. In a dim office far from executive floors, a systems engineer stared at raw data long after everyone else had left. She'd bypassed filters, ignored instructions, and pulled unedited feeds from multiple failures. She noticed something no one else had. Every incident aligned along invisible vectors, paths of movement that didn't intersect but paralleled, like someone walking through the world without touching it, and the world warping slightly in response. She whispered, "It's not passive." Her access was revoked the next morning. Vought's third mistake was involving Homelander. They didn't tell him everything. They never did, but they fed him enough to trigger his instincts. Words like observer, unknown, non-responsive. They framed it as a challenge to authority, not a threat to existence. Homelander took the bait immediately. If something was watching and not reacting, then it needed to be reminded who mattered. He staged appearances, flew lower, pushed harder. Public rescues became performances of excess force. Criminals died when they didn't need to. Cameras caught the violence in unflattering angles. The public didn't cheer the way they used to. They watched. Homelander felt that shift like a cold draft under his skin. The attention was still there, but it had changed flavor. Less awe, more unease. High above, Whis observed Homelander's arc with gentle curiosity. Not interest, documentation. He noted how power without resistance began to fold inward. The boy saw it too. "This is bad," Huey said quietly, watching a broadcast of Homelander tearing through a suspect while the crowd recoiled instead of applauding. "He's spiraling." Butcher didn't smile. "Nah, this is worse. He's trying to remind the world he's real." Crossed his arms, "And it's not working." They didn't know about Whis. They only knew something had removed the usual ceiling from events. No reset, no cosmic safety net. Vaught's internal reports grew contradictory. One division argued the anomaly was harmless. Another labeled it an extinction-level oversight. Neither could prove anything. Whis passed through a boardroom as executives debated pulling back operations globally. He lingered just long enough for their arguments to fracture into self-preservation. He had seen this before in other universes. Not collapse through destruction. Collapse through hesitation. Late that night, Vaught's AI triggered a final alert, an internal threshold breach caused by cumulative uncertainty. The system recommended a full operational freeze to reassess reality conditions. The recommendation was overridden in under 10 seconds. Whis watched the override with quiet approval. The universe had reached the point where it would rather guess wrong than admit ignorance. That was always the turning point. As dawn broke unevenly across a city, running on delayed reactions and hollow confidence, Whis finally shifted his attention outward, toward the wider world beyond corporate glass and manufactured heroes. Observation phase complete. The next stage would not require his presence to change anything at all. The shift didn't announce itself with a headline. There was no single disaster large enough to force recognition, no defining image that captured the change. Instead, it arrived the way weather changes do, subtle at first, felt only by those paying close attention. A delay here, a hesitation there, a moment where someone looked up, waiting for a familiar intervention that never came. In Chicago, a bridge collapse trapped dozens of commuters between twisted steel and rising water. Emergency services were dispatched, but coordination fractured almost immediately. Jurisdictional confusion slowed response times. A soup assigned to reinforcement arrived, assessed the risk, and chose not to act without explicit clearance. Clearance never came. People were rescued eventually, some weren't. The news cycle treated it as mismanagement. Vought issued condolences. Homelander didn't appear. Across social media, a new phrase began circulating, not as outrage but as resignation. They didn't show up. Whis observed the conversation from a rooftop no one ever visited, staff resting lightly against his shoulder. He did not need to listen closely. The tone was enough. This was the moment when expectation began to erode. Heroes were still present, SUP still existed, but the assumption that someone would intervene that had quietly dissolved. Homelander felt it most acutely. He stood inside a Vought briefing room, walls lined with screens displaying real-time incidents across the country. Fires burned longer, riots spread wider before containment. SUPs hesitated on camera, glancing off frame as if waiting for permission that no longer arrived. Homelander clenched his fists. "Why am I not on these feeds?" he demanded. Executives exchanged careful looks. Someone muttered something about optics, about strategic deployment, about letting local teams handle manageable situations. Homelander heard only one thing. They didn't need him the way they used to. He left the room without another word, the glass doors shattering outward as he passed. No one reprimanded him. No one chased him down. The silence afterward was worse than confrontation. That afternoon, Homelander forced a public appearance, descending into a downtown protest that had turned volatile. He landed hard, cracking asphalt, cape billowing, voice raised to command attention. The crowd didn't scatter. They didn't cheer either. Phones came out, not at all out of habit. Homelander felt the difference immediately. Fear was there, but it was diluted, mixed with something else. Fatigue, distrust, a quiet calculation of whether he would make things better or worse. He barked orders anyway. A man shouted back. Homelander's jaw tightened. For a moment, the old reflex surged, the desire to remind them. Then he stopped. Cameras were everywhere, and somewhere, deep in his awareness, that same sensation returned. The feeling of being observed by something that didn't care if he succeeded or failed. He left without resolving anything. The protest dispersed on its own hours later, more chaotic than before. The boys watched the footage in silence. "This isn't collapse," MM said finally. "It's drift." Huey nodded. "People don't expect saving anymore. They're just adjusting." Butcher exhaled smoke slowly, eyes fixed on the paused image of Homelander mid-hover, expression uncertain. World's learning a bad habit. When no one's coming, you stop asking. That night, a hospital in Sao Paulo lost power during a heat wave. Backup generators failed after maintenance cuts routed funds elsewhere. Doctors worked by phone, light, and instinct. Patients died quietly, not violently, not in a way that demanded spectacle. Whis stood at the far end of the ward, invisible to everyone, smile unchanged. He was not recording tragedies. He was nodding adaptation. By morning, emergency protocols were rewritten, not to rely on heroes, to account for their absence. In Tokyo, a municipal council voted to reduce soup response integration, citing unpredictability. In Berlin, insurance companies adjusted risk models to exclude last-minute intervention variables. In New York, a charity removed the phrase "protected by heroes" from its fundraising materials. Vought noticed all of it too late. Their brand had always depended on inevitability, the idea that no matter how bad things got, someone extraordinary would arrive. Now, the world was quietly deciding that assumption was no longer safe. Internal projections spiraled. Marketing campaigns felt hollow. New SUPs tested well in focus groups but failed to inspire confidence. The illusion of control cracked, not from attack, but from neglect. Whis drifted through a Vought archive late that evening, passing rows of legacy footage. Old rescues, smiling faces, manufactured triumphs. He paused briefly at a frame showing Homelander lifting debris as a crowd cheered. He tilted his head. That version of reality, no longer aligned with current outcomes. Homelander sensed it again while flying aimlessly over the ocean, wind tearing at his suit. He screamed, not in rage but in frustration, sound swallowed instantly by distance. "No," he said aloud, as if correcting the sky, "they still need me." But the world below wasn't listening. The boys felt the consequences ripple outward. Crime didn't spike dramatically. It became cautious. Criminals adapted too, testing boundaries where heroes used to intervene automatically. Sups grew more conservative, protecting themselves as much as civilians. Power structures didn't shatter. They loosened. Whis observed a final scene before shifting his focus. A small town in the Midwest faced a chemical spill after an industrial accident. Emergency crews arrived understaffed. No soup response was scheduled. The mayor held a press conference, voice shaking, and said something no official would have dared say months ago. "We're handling this ourselves." The statement spread faster than the footage. Whis smiled just slightly wider. This universe had reached the point of self-correction, not through guidance, but through abandonment. And that was always the most dangerous stage. Because once a world stops expecting rescue, it begins making choices it never would have dared before. High above, Whis adjusted his grip on his staff and turned his gaze outward, beyond cities and corporations, toward forces that would soon notice the shift as well. Observation would continue, but the consequences were no longer confined to Earth. The first emergency meeting wasn't called because of an attack. It was called because nothing happened. In Geneva, representatives from 12 nations gathered behind closed doors, screens filled with incident reports that shared a single, unsettling pattern: delayed responses, absent interventions, situations once classified as hero-resolved now logged as self-contained outcomes. The language had shifted quietly, but the implications were enormous. One defense minister leaned forward and asked the question no one wanted to answer. What happens if they don't come anymore? No one said Homelander's name. They didn't need to. Military planners had spent decades building contingencies around escalation, how to respond if sups went rogue, how to coordinate if heroes failed. None of those models addressed a world where intervention simply faded, where the most powerful assets became unreliable variables rather than guarantees. Budgets were reallocated that same week. Rapid response units were expanded. Civil defense drills returned in cities that hadn't practiced them since the Cold War. Satellite networks were recalibrated, not to track enemies, but to monitor gaps, places where help should have arrived and didn't. Governments didn't announce these changes. They framed them as resilience initiatives, preparedness, self-reliance. But beneath the language was fear. Not of invasion, of abandonment. Whis observed the meeting from the far edge of the room, visible to no one, staff resting lightly against the marble floor. He watched body language more than data, the tightening of shoulders, the way officials avoided looking at certain screens. This was not panic. Panic was loud. This was recalibration. Homelander found out last. He learned the same way he'd been learning everything lately, through omission. A scheduled joint appearance with a European task force quietly canceled. Invitations stopped coming. Briefings grew shorter, more procedural. When he confronted a VOT liaison, the answer was rehearsed. Governments are exploring diversified response options. Homelander stared at him, eyes burning. Say it again, slower. The liaison swallowed. They don't want to rely on a single figure. Something inside Homelander fractured, not dramatically, not explosively. It was a hairline crack spreading under pressure. He didn't shout. He didn't kill anyone. He simply turned and left, walking through reinforced doors as if they weren't there. Over the next days, he tried to reassert presence the only way he knew how. He intervened aggressively, arrived early, stayed late, made examples where restraint might have served better. The cameras caught everything: his intensity, his volatility, the way situations escalated instead of resolving. Public response hardened. Not outrage, concern. Commentators spoke carefully about emotional stability. Analysts questioned whether unilateral power was still desirable. Even supporters began using conditional language. Homelander didn't hear praise anymore. He heard evaluation. The boys tracked the shift from their usual safe distance. "They're building fallback plans," Huey said, scrolling through leaked procurement requests. "Non-soup rapid units, hardened infrastructure. It's like they're preparing for weather, not heroes." Butcher snorted. "Took M long enough." "Isn't that bad?" Huey asked. "I mean less reliance on sups." Butcher didn't answer immediately. He watched footage of a city evacuation carried out without hero involvement. Slower, messier, but deliberate. "World without gods," he muttered. "Always ends bloody, just takes time." Whis shifted focus again, drifting through a military training ground at dawn. Soldiers ran drills against scenarios that used to be theoretical. No capes, no last-second rescues, just attrition, logistics, sacrifice. He nodded once. This was adaptation. In Washington, a classified report circulated among senior officials. It avoided names, avoided speculation, but one conclusion was underlined repeatedly. The presence of an unresponsive higher-order observer correlates with increased systemic risk. They didn't know what Whis was. They only knew something had changed. Vought attempted to counter the narrative with force. New hero launches, spectacle-driven rescues, carefully staged events designed to remind the public of dependence. The effort backfired almost immediately. One staged crisis went off script when a supporting soup hesitated, unsure whether to escalate without approval. The delay cost lives. The footage leaked before Vought could scrub it. Confidence eroded further. Whis watched the fallout from a quiet perch above the city, expression serene. He was not impressed by preparation. He was interested in what came next. That night, Homelander stood alone in Vought Tower, staring down at streets that felt farther away than ever. He could hear the city, smell it, feel its pulse. And for the first time, he wasn't sure it wanted him hovering overhead. He clenched his fists. "They're planning for a world without me," he whispered. Somewhere beyond perception, Whis turned his gaze upward, as if noting a variable finally reaching instability. Governments had begun preparing for no one. And in doing so, they were about to provoke something far more dangerous than chaos. They were about to test what happened when the abandoned noticed they were being replaced. Homelander didn't decide to make a statement. Statements were deliberate, measured, planned. What happened next came from something more dangerous than rage. It came from urgency, the kind that forms when power senses itself slipping out of relevance, when dominance is no longer assumed, only questioned. The incident began in Chicago. A freight train derailed near a densely populated district just after sunrise. No explosion, no sabotage, just a cascade of steel and momentum that crushed buildings along the track. Emergency services responded immediately. Evacuation orders went out. For 8 full minutes, the situation unfolded exactly as the new protocols intended. Then Homelander arrived. He didn't coordinate. He didn't wait. He descended like punctuation, ripping twisted metal free with unnecessary force, tossing wreckage aside as if daring the cameras to look away. His voice boomed over sirens, promising safety, promising control, promising that everything was handled now. The crowd didn't cheer. They watched. That hesitation, barely a second, was enough to throw him off. He worked faster, harder, louder. Each action escalated. Each correction created more damage. A collapsing structure he could have stabilized was instead torn free, forcing responders to retreat. By the time the situation ended, casualties had doubled. The headlines were careful, no accusations, no condemnation. Just questions. Was intervention premature? Did force worsen the outcome? Are heroes adapting to new response realities? Homelander read every word. He flew until the city disappeared behind him, until clouds blurred into streaks, until the pressure in his chest felt like it might finally break open into something loud and definitive. Instead, it stayed contained, focused. He needed to remind the world what certainty looked like. Vought encouraged him cautiously. A senior executive framed it as reassurance strategy, a return to visibility, controlled dominance, clear wins. The implication was obvious. If power still mattered, it had to be proven cleanly, publicly, undeniably. They gave him targets, low-risk zones, predictable outcomes, carefully staged threats where success was guaranteed. Homelander accepted without hesitation. The first 3 went exactly as planned: fires extinguished, hostages freed, villains neutralized before escalation. The footage was pristine. Vought pushed it hard. But the response was muted. Not ungrateful, not hostile. Just smaller. Praise came with caveats. Applause followed by analysis. Even supporters spoke about appropriate application of force and evolving standards. Homelander felt like a relic being evaluated for relevance. The boys watched the pattern unfold with growing unease. "He's not losing," Huey said, scanning reports, "but he's not winning either." "That's worse," Butcher replied. "Bloke like him needs worship. Take that away, he'll tear the place down just to feel tall again." Frowned. "You think he'll snap?" Butcher shook his head slowly. "No, I think he'll try to be perfect." Above them all, Whis observed. He watched Homelander's interventions not as acts of power, but as data points, adjustments, overcorrections, the way a system destabilizes when feedback loops break. In one instance, Whis hovered unseen above a coastal rescue. Homelander lifted a capsized ferry with flawless precision, muscles straining just enough to look heroic, not desperate. The maneuver was textbook. The passengers survived. And still, the cameras focused on the rescue crews, coordinating beneath him. Not the god above them. Whis smiled faintly. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, not collapse but misalignment. When power no longer matched expectation. When effort increased but impact diminished. That night, Homelander confronted Vought again. "They don't see it," he said, packing like a caged animal. "I'm doing everything right." An executive nodded too quickly. Public trust takes time to recalibrate. Recalibrate. The word echoed in Homelander's head long after he left. The next incident was not sanctioned. A suspected soup cell was flagged in South America, unconfirmed, low priority, awaiting verification. Homelander diverted without clearance, arriving before local authorities even knew what they were responding to. He struck hard, fast, final. The cell was neutralized. So were 3 adjacent blocks. The footage was impossible to spin. Governments responded within hours. Statements emphasized jurisdiction, proportionality, the need for restraint. Allies issued carefully worded concerns. Homelander watched the broadcasts in silence. They weren't afraid. They were managing him. The realization hit deeper than fear ever had. Somewhere above the fallout, Whis drifted through the upper atmosphere, staff spinning lazily in his grip. He wasn't watching the destruction. He was watching the reaction. This was what happened when power tried to prove itself instead of being accepted. When dominance chased validation instead of commanding it. Whis already knew how this arc ended. He simply wanted to see how long it would take for everyone else to realize. Back in New York, Homelander stood before a mirror, jaw tight, eyes bloodshot but focused. "They need to remember," he said to his reflection. "They just need one reminder." Outside, the city moved on without him. And far above it all, the observer remained, patient as ever, as the next escalation locked itself into place, not as a choice, but as an inevitability set in motion the moment power decided it still mattered. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no single moment where the world collectively decided Homelander no longer defined power. No speech, no rebellion, no grand rejection. It happened the way erosion always does, quietly, incrementally in the space between expectations and reality. The first sign was hesitation. Not from civilians, from institutions. A hurricane formed off the Atlantic coast, rapidly intensifying beyond projections. In previous years, Homelander would have been deployed immediately, his presence framed as reassurance before landfall. This time, emergency councils debated alternatives: evacuation logistics, infrastructure reinforcement, military coordination. Homelander was listed as a contingency, not the plan. By the time he arrived, the storm had already made landfall. National Guard units were in place. Engineers were stabilizing levees. Rescue helicopters filled the sky. Homelander hovered above it all, waiting for the cue that never came. He intervened anyway. He carved a corridor through the storm, dispersing cloud formations with brute force, bending wind patterns through sheer speed. It was spectacular. It was effective. And it wasn't necessary. The storm had already begun to weaken. The headlines the next day reflected that ambiguity. Hero assists response, not saves city. Analysts debated meteorological variables. Officials praised coordination. Homelander was mentioned last. He felt something in his chest tighten. Not anger, not fear, but displacement. As if the world had rearranged itself slightly while he wasn't looking, and now he no longer fit where he used to stand. Vought noticed the metrics. Engagement was down, approval ratings plateaued. Focus groups described Homelander as unstable, excessive, and most damning of all, unpredictable. They didn't say dangerous. They said unreliable. Vought responded the only way it knew how, by manufacturing certainty. A controlled threat was staged in Eastern Europe. A rogue soup cell, real enough to be dangerous, contained enough to be managed. Homelander was briefed extensively. Clear objectives, defined limits, absolute media control. He followed the plan perfectly. The operation was flawless. No collateral, no civilian casualties. The targets were neutralized in under 3 minutes. The footage was cinematic. And still, the response was subdued. Viewers praised the professionalism. Commentators noted the restraint. Experts highlighted the importance of protocols over individual power. Homelander wasn't the headline. The system was. He returned to the tower in silence. In the days that followed, something new crept into public consciousness. Not distrust, but independence. Cities invested more heavily in emergency infrastructure. Governments accelerated soup-neutral response training. The language shifted from reliance to preparedness. Homelander watched all of it like someone slowly realizing a party had ended hours ago. The boys noticed too. "They're building around him," Huey said quietly, staring at a briefing screen. "Like he's weather, not leadership." Butcher exhaled smoke slowly. That's what breaks him, not a punch, not a plan being optional. Homelander tried to reassert presence through frequency. More appearances, more patrols, more unscheduled interventions. He showed up everywhere: fires, floods, hostage situations, often before authorities even arrived. At first, people were startled, then annoyed, then indifferent. There were whispers now about escalation, about risk, about whether his involvement complicated more than it solved. Nothing overt, nothing actionable. Just doubt. High above the atmosphere, Whis observed the pattern unfold with serene interest. This was not collapse, this was decoupling. a universe slowly learning it could function without centering itself around a single force. Not because that force was gone, but because it was no longer trusted to define outcomes. Whis had seen this before in different forms across countless systems. When a dominant element loses narrative alignment, it doesn't disappear. It destabilizes. Homelander felt it most acutely in silence. Meetings ended faster. Briefings became transactional. Vought executives spoke to him with rehearsed calm, as if managing volatility rather than commanding a god. One afternoon, during a routine patrol, he stopped midair above Manhattan, just hovered. No alarms, no threats, no emergencies. People passed below without looking up. The realization hit him like a delayed impact. They weren't afraid. They weren't reassured. They just didn't care. Something fractured then, not loudly, not visibly, but decisively. That night, Homelander stood alone in the tower, staring out at a city that no longer revolved around him. He clenched his fists, then forced them open. Rage would only confirm their doubts. He needed something else. A demonstration that couldn't be contextualized. A moment that reasserted inevitability. Vought tried to intervene, cautioned patience, suggested optics. Homelander ignored them. He selected a target that wasn't a threat, but a symbol. A fortified soup training facility recently completed without Vought oversight. Independent, government-funded, designed explicitly to operate without him. He arrived without warning. There was no explosion, no massacre, just overwhelming presence. He dismantled the outer defenses methodically, proving he could breach anything if he chose to. He stopped short of total destruction. A message, not an attack. The reaction was immediate and wrong. Instead of fear, there was outrage, political condemnation, emergency sessions, sanctions, investigations. The language was unanimous, unacceptable, unnecessary, destabilizing. Homelander watched the coverage in disbelief. They weren't afraid of him crossing the line. They were angry he had. For the first time, power had become a liability. Above it all, Whis drifted closer, his smile unchanged. This was the threshold. The point where dominance, once unquestioned, becomes contested, not by force, but by refusal to center it anymore. Whis knew what came next. Not rebellion. Correction. Homelander stood at the edge of a world that no longer believed in him the way it once had. And belief once lost does not return easily. The system had begun to move without him. And the consequences of that shift were already unfolding. The first act of resistance was not defiance. It was omission. Homelander expected escalation after the training facility incident. Protests, riots, panic, something loud enough to force the world back into reacting around him. Instead, what followed was process. Committees formed. Hearings were announced. Jurisdiction was debated. Responsibility was diffused across agencies so thoroughly that no single target remained. There was nothing to confront. No enemy to intimidate. No singular voice to silence. The world responded the way bureaucracies always do when faced with an uncontrollable variable, by surrounding it with procedures until its impact diminished. Homelander was no longer opposed, he was managed. Emergency response doctrines were quietly updated. New clauses were added that emphasized de-escalation through redundancy. Independent rapid response units were deployed alongside SUPs, not beneath them. The language was careful, respectful, non-confrontational, but unmistakable. Homelander was no longer central. He noticed it first in the sky. Airspace restrictions adjusted around his patrol routes, not to block him, just to avoid reliance. Military aircraft rerouted themselves automatically when he appeared, as if his presence were a storm system rather than command authority. When he landed near an active incident, teams continued operating without looking to him for direction. They acknowledged him politely, accepted assistance if offered, never asked. It was infuriating precisely because it wasn't hostile. Vought attempted to course correct. Public relations campaigns emphasized unity. Messaging framed Homelander as a partner rather than a pillar. Carefully curated interviews portrayed him as a stabilizing force within a broader system. The result backfired. Audiences didn't reject the message, they absorbed it. If Homelander was just one component, then losing him would not mean collapse. That idea spread faster than any scandal. The boys watched the shift with cautious disbelief. "They're not fighting him," Huey muttered, scanning reports. "They're just moving on." Butcher's jaw tightened. "That's worse. You can punch back at a fist, you can't punch apathy." Homelander tried to force engagement through proximity. He showed up unannounced at crisis centers, sat in on briefings, inserted himself into decision-making spaces that once deferred automatically. The response was consistent. Polite acknowledgement, firm boundaries. "Thank you for your input. We'll take that under advisement. We have this covered." Every phrase was a reminder, you are optional. The breaking point didn't come from humiliation. It came from irrelevance becoming systemic. A coordinated attack hit 3 cities simultaneously. Precision strikes, sophisticated planning, exactly the kind of crisis that once would have been framed around Homelander's intervention. This time, the response unfolded without him. Specialized teams deployed, intelligence units coordinated in real time. SUPs were used surgically, their actions constrained by layered oversight. The operation was messy, but effective. By the time Homelander arrived at the 3rd site, the threat was already neutralized. No cameras waited. No officials rushed to greet him. He hovered above the aftermath, watching responders secure the area, and felt something unfamiliar creep into his chest. Not rage. Displacement. The world had acted without asking permission. Later, analysts praised the outcome as proof of resilience. Commentators spoke about adaptability, about systems maturing beyond singular dependence. Homelander was mentioned only in passing. That night, Vaught's internal crisis escalated. Executives argued behind closed doors. Some pushed for renewed dominance displays. Others warned against provoking further backlash. The data was undeniable. Every aggressive move accelerated disengagement. Homelander was becoming a destabilizing factor rather than a stabilizer. And the system was correcting for it. Whis observed the inflection point with quiet fascination. This was not rebellion, not revolution, it was optimization. When a variable introduces more uncertainty than value, complex systems adapt by reducing reliance. No malice required, no intent. Just adjustment. Homelander felt it everywhere. In the way people spoke around him instead of to him. In the way plans proceeded whether he approved or not. In the way fear, once automatic, now required effort, and effort made it obvious. He attempted restraint. For a time, he followed protocols meticulously, limited appearances, controlled speech, measured force. He became exactly what they asked him to be. It didn't help. The system didn't revert, it continued forward. Because adaptation, once begun, does not reverse easily. The realization hit him slowly. He could no longer force relevance through presence alone. The rules had changed without his consent. He needed to be essential again. Not powerful. Necessary. That meant redefining the stakes. Homelander began withdrawing selectively, skipping appearances, ignoring minor crises, letting situations strain without his intervention. He expected fear to return in his absence. It didn't. Other forces filled the gaps. sometimes imperfectly, sometimes slowly, but enough. The world did not collapse. That truth hollowed him out more than any defeat. Vought panicked. Stock volatility spiked as investors questioned long-term dependency strategies. Internal reports flagged brand dilution. Emergency sessions debated whether Homelander himself had become a liability to be mitigated. The unthinkable was now discussable. Homelander sensed the shift immediately. He confronted executives directly, demanded reassurance, demanded affirmation. They gave him neither. They gave him language. Careful, non-committal, corporate. He left the room before rage could surface, but the damage was done. For the first time, he understood the nature of the resistance he faced. No fists, no weapons, just a world that no longer arranged itself around him. High above, Whis inclined his head slightly. This was the moment many universes failed to recognize in time. When dominance loses narrative gravity, force becomes noise, and noise is filtered out. Homelander stood alone on a rooftop, watching the city function without him. Lights moved, sirens sounded, life continued. The resistance wasn't trying to defeat him. It was proving it didn't need him. And that realization set something irreversible in motion. The most dangerous change did not announce itself with panic or collapse. It arrived quietly, embedded in routine. Emergency protocols that once centered around Homelander's availability were rewritten again, not as a response to his behavior but as a refinement. His name was no longer highlighted. It appeared in footnotes, contingencies, optional branches. A powerful asset, yes, but no longer a keystone. That distinction mattered more than anyone publicly admitted. The first time Homelander realized his power had become background noise was during a live broadcast he wasn't supposed to be part of. A coordinated humanitarian response unfolded across multiple regions after a massive infrastructure failure. Logistics were complex, timelines tight, mistakes inevitable. Homelander arrived anyway. He descended into frame with practiced precision, cape settling, posture immaculate. Cameras caught him clearly. Once, that entrance alone would have redirected the narrative. This time, the anchor acknowledged him with a brief nod and continued speaking. And response teams report stabilization in the northern sector. Homelander has arrived on site, though officials confirm the operation remains on schedule. On schedule. Not saved. Not dependent. Just ongoing. Homelander stared into the camera, waiting for the cue that never came. No shift in tone, no deferential pause. The broadcast moved on. He left without speaking. Behind the scenes, analysts didn't debate his intentions. They debated efficiency metrics. Could response times be improved further? Were redundancies sufficient? Did reliance on SUPs introduce unnecessary unpredictability? His power wasn't questioned. Its usefulness was. The boys noticed the change too. Frenchie watched a declassified briefing scroll passed on a stolen tablet. "They're modeling worst-case scenarios without him," he said quietly. "Not against him, without him." Huey swallowed. That's new. Butcher didn't respond. He was watching something else. The footage wasn't dramatic, just Homelander hovering above a disaster site while coordinated teams worked around him. Ignored. "That's how you kill a god," Butcher muttered. "You make him surplus." Homelander tried escalation again, but this time not through violence. He tried indispensability. He began intervening early, anticipating threats, showing up before plans were finalized. He wanted to prove that without him, outcomes would be worse. The results were mixed. Sometimes he helped. Sometimes he complicated things. Sometimes his presence forced recalibration that slowed response. Each incident generated more data. And data does not lie. Internal assessments concluded that Homelander's unpredictability, emotional volatility, need for validation, deviation from protocol, introduced measurable inefficiencies. The word liability appeared again. Vought buried it under layers of euphemism, but Homelander felt it. Meetings ended sooner when he entered. Decisions were framed as already made. His input was acknowledged, then neutralized. He began to sense something far worse than opposition. He was being optimized around. Whis watched this phase with particular interest. Across countless universes, power structures eventually reach a point where raw force stops being the dominant currency. Systems evolve, not morally, mechanically. Anything that cannot be predicted, modeled, or integrated becomes friction. And friction is eliminated. Homelander's attempts to reassert dominance grew more erratic. Not violent, yet but performative. He saved harder, spoke louder, took credit where none was offered. The world responded with diminishing returns. Public opinion fractured, not into outrage but indifference. Clips of Homelander began sharing without commentary. Memes weren't mocking, they were bored. That was new. Fear had always been his gravity. Without it, everything drifted. The breaking point came during a classified summit involving multiple governments and Vought leadership. The topic was resilience planning, redundancy, long-term stability in a world with unstable subs. Homelander was not invited. He learned about it from a leaked agenda. He arrived anyway. The room went silent when he entered, not afraid, not awed, just paused like a process interrupted. An official spoke first, calm, measured. "This session is restricted." Homelander smiled tightly. "I think I belong here." A glance was exchanged. Data flickered on a screen behind them, charts, models, scenarios. "You've already been accounted for," the official replied. That sentence shattered something. Accounted for. Not consulted. Not required. Homelander lashed out verbally, demanding recognition, accusing them of betrayal, of ingratitude, of forgetting what kept them safe. No one argued. They listened. They waited for him to finish. And then the meeting resumed. Security did not escort him out. No one needed to. He left on his own, the door closing softly behind him. Outside, he hovered for a long time, staring at nothing. Whis observed from a distance that wasn't physical. This was the stage where gods often made their worst choices. When power, stripped of narrative centrality, attempts to reassert itself through force alone. But Homelander hesitated. Because somewhere deep inside, he understood the truth. Even if he destroyed the room, even if he burned the city, the system would adapt again, and he would still be unnecessary. Vought's internal collapse accelerated. Departments began preparing for contingencies that no longer assumed Homelander's cooperation. Quiet succession planning, asset redistribution, legal insulation. Not rebellion. Preparation. Homelander sensed the walls closing, not through threat but through omission. His calls went unanswered longer. His appearances were scheduled less frequently. His image, once ubiquitous, began to fade from constant reinforcement. Power had not left him. Meaning had. That night, Whis finally shifted his attention slightly, just enough to be felt. Homelander froze midair, a sudden, inexplicable awareness crawling up his spine. Not fear exactly. Recognition. He couldn't see Whis, couldn't hear him, but he knew. Someone was watching, who did not care whether he acted or not. Someone for whom this entire collapse was not a crisis, but a data point. Homelander's breath hitched. For the first time, the thought surfaced uninvited. What if this is how it ends? Not with a fight, but with everyone deciding they don't need you anymore. That question didn't break him. but it pushed him toward a decision he could no longer delay. Because if God-level power had become an afterthought, then the only way to matter again was to make the world remember why it once revolved around him. And that resolve set the final sequence into motion. The first sign that the world had crossed a line came not from Homelander, but from the systems built to endure him. A multinational security council quietly ratified a doctrine that had been circulating for months under neutral language. It emphasized decentralized authority, layered response autonomy, and the elimination of single-point dependencies. In simpler terms, no individual, soup or otherwise, would ever again be allowed to function as the final decision-maker in a crisis. It passed unanimously. No speeches, no fanfare, just a signature added to a document that redefined how power moved through the world. Homelander learned about it the same way he'd learned everything lately, too late, and from the margins. A junior analyst mentioned it offhand during a briefing, assuming he already knew. When Homelander asked for clarification, the analyst froze, then deferred to a supervisor. The supervisor explained it clinically. "This isn't about you," they said. "It's about resilience." Homelander smiled through clenched teeth and said nothing, but something fundamental shifted inside him. For the first time, he wasn't being challenged or replaced. He was being designed around. Across the globe, the change manifested in subtle but unmistakable ways. Military units received standing orders that allowed independent engagement decisions without escalation approval if SUPs were involved. Intelligence agencies began sharing data laterally rather than funneling it upward. Even media outlets adjusted framing, focusing on collective response rather than singular hero narratives. No one asked Homelander to approve these changes. No one needed to. The boys saw the writing on the wall. "They're cutting him out," Huey said quietly, scrolling through leaked memos. "Not attacking, not exposing, just bypassing." Butcher leaned back, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "That's what scares me. When the world stops asking permission, it means it's ready for consequences." Homelander felt those consequences building before they arrived. He tested boundaries cautiously at first, issued a public directive during a crisis, expecting immediate compliance. Response teams acknowledged receipt and proceeded with their own plan. He intercepted a military operation mid-deployment, hovering visibly above armored columns, waiting for the familiar pause, the unspoken request for guidance. The vehicles drove past him. Not disrespectfully, just decisively. Each moment reinforced the same unbearable truth. Authority no longer flowed toward him. It flowed around him. Vought's position became untenable. Their influence had relied on controlling the narrative around SUPs, especially Homelander. Now, that narrative was dissolving into something broader and harder to steer. Executives argued behind closed doors. Some demanded drastic action to reassert dominance. Others warned that any overt move would accelerate the decoupling process already underway. One phrase kept recurring in internal documents: uncontrolled escalation risk. Homelander saw it in a report and laughed. They weren't afraid of him losing control. They were afraid of what would happen if he tried to regain it. The tipping point came during a coordinated international exercise designed to test the new doctrine. Simulated disasters, layered threats, multiple SUP assets deployed under independent command structures. Homelander was deliberately excluded. When he confronted Vought leadership about it, they didn't deny the decision. They justified it. "This isn't punishment," an executive said carefully. "It's adaptation." Homelander's voice dropped. "You don't adapt around a god." The executive met his gaze, pale but resolute. "That's the thing. We don't think of you that way anymore." Silence followed, thick, final. Homelander left without another word, but the damage was irreparable. That statement echoed louder than any insult or threat. Across the city, Whis observed the exercise with serene interest. He watched command structures operate without a central figure, watched decision trees branch dynamically, watched mistakes occur and be corrected without divine intervention. This was not chaos. It was maturation. In universes that survived long enough, this moment always arrived, when reliance on gods gave way to systems designed to endure gods. Homelander felt the pressure mounting like a physical weight. The world was no longer waiting for him to decide whether to act. It was acting first and dealing with consequences later. He considered violence, not impulsively, strategically. A demonstration, a reminder, something undeniable. But every scenario he imagined ended the same way. Immediate outrage, rapid mobilization, coordinated resistance, not defeat, but containment, adaptation, further marginalization. Even destruction would only prove the doctrine right. That realization terrified him. Because for the first time his power had limits, not physical ones but contextual ones. He could still burn cities, still tear armies apart. But he could no longer control what that meant. The boys felt the tension spike. "He's running out of moves," Frenchie said. "That's when he gets unpredictable." Butcher nodded grimly, "or desperate." Homelander retreated from public view, not as a strategy, out of confusion. The city lights below him no longer felt like an audience, just infrastructure. He hovered high above, watching the world function without acknowledging him, and finally understood what Whis had known all along. This wasn't rebellion. This wasn't defiance. This was evolution. And Homelander was becoming obsolete in real time. The question was no longer whether he would act. It was whether the world would even care when he did. That realization hardened into something dangerous. Because if the world had stopped asking for permission, then Homelander would make a decision so loud, so unavoidable, that permission would become irrelevant again. And somewhere beyond sight, Whis noted the shift. Not with concern, but with the calm recognition that the final variable had entered play. The decision Homelander made was not sudden. It formed slowly, hardened by weeks of silence, indifference, and systems that continued to function as if he were already gone. What finally pushed him past the threshold was not a provocation, but a report, buried deep in a data feed, summarizing projected outcomes if Homelander were permanently removed from active operations. The conclusion was blunt. Operational efficiency would decrease briefly, then stabilize. Long-term resilience would improve. No mention of chaos. No mention of collapse. No mention of fear. Homelander stared at the words until the screen cracked beneath his grip. He didn't want worship anymore. He didn't even want obedience. He wanted proof. Proof that the world still needed him. So he chose a place that mattered symbolically, not strategically. A city that had once celebrated him endlessly. Cameras everywhere. Civilian density high enough to force reaction but not annihilation. He descended in full view, announcing nothing, doing nothing, just hovering, waiting for the familiar ripple of panic. It never came. People looked up, phones rose, some backed away, others kept walking. Emergency services activated calmly, traffic rerouted. Public alerts advised shelter as a precaution, not an emergency. Precaution. That word landed like a blade. Homelander escalated, not with violence but with presence. He flew low, cracked pavement with sonic booms, stared down responders, daring someone to flinch. They didn't. They followed protocol. That's when he snapped. The strike was contained, a single structure, a controlled show of force meant to reset the narrative. The building collapsed inward, devastating but localized. He waited for the scream, literal or figurative, that would confirm his relevance. What followed instead was coordination. Response teams mobilized instantly. SUPs arrived under layered command. Drones documented the scene dispassionately. Officials spoke clearly, firmly, condemning the act without hysteria. They didn't beg him to stop. They didn't plead. They moved past him. The world treated the act not as divine wrath, but as an incident. That was the moment Homelander realized his mistake. By acting, he hadn't reclaimed his status. He had defined it. Whis observed the aftermath without blinking. Across timelines and universes, this pattern repeated with cruel consistency. When power loses narrative centrality, its final act is often an attempt to etch meaning through destruction. But meaning does not come from force alone, it comes from context. And Homelander had chosen the wrong context. Public perception shifted decisively, not into fear, but into categorization. Analysts stopped debating his psychology and began discussing mitigation. Legislators accelerated measures that had once been theoretical. Language hardened. Terrorist, unstable actor, containment priority. Vought collapsed inward. Stock trading was halted. Executives disappeared into legal seclusion. Entire departments were shuttered overnight. The company that had once framed Homelander as a symbol of order now scrambled to distance itself from him entirely. Internal communications were leaked, not by whistleblowers, but by frightened middle managers trying to save themselves. The narrative broke free. The boys watched the fallout unfold with grim clarity. He didn't scare them, Huey said quietly. He convinced them. Butcher nodded. Yeah, he finally gave them a reason to stop pretending. Homelander felt the walls closing in, not physically, but conceptually. Every move he made now reinforced the same story. Every appearance confirmed the same conclusion. He wasn't a god anymore. He was a problem. And problems don't get remembered for their power. They get remembered for their damage. He tried to course correct. Public statements, controlled rescues, attempts at restraint. It didn't matter. The system had already adapted again. And this time, it wasn't adapting around him. It was adapting against him. Whis turned his attention fully now, not because the outcome was uncertain, but because it was final. The moment a being understands how it will be remembered, the path forward narrows drastically. Homelander felt it too. Not defeat, not fear, but the crushing certainty that whatever came next would define him forever, and that he no longer controlled how the world interpreted his actions. He had wanted to be remembered as essential. Instead, he had taught the world how to live without him. And that realization pushed him toward one last, irreversible choice. One that would ensure his name was never ignored again, even if it meant being remembered for the wrong reason. The world did not decide to end Homelander in a single meeting, a single vote, or a single moment of outrage. It decided through accumulation, through reports stacked on reports, through contingency plans that stopped being hypothetical, through the quiet consensus that formed when every institution, every government, and every system reached the same conclusion independently. Homelander was no longer a problem to manage. He was a risk to eliminate. There was no announcement, no declaration of war. The first sign came when airspace around major cities shifted permanently, not temporarily. Then came the coordinated withdrawal of all remaining Vought assets from Homelander's proximity. No handlers, no liaisons, no support teams, just distance. Even his appearances stopped being framed as events. They were logged as incidents. Homelander noticed the silence before anything else. His feeds no longer buzzed with panic or outrage. Social media didn't explode when he appeared. News coverage referenced him the way it referenced natural disasters: serious, factual, impersonal. He wasn't feared. He was accounted for. That was when the final phase began. A global protocol activated quietly, designed not to confront Homelander directly, but to box him in conceptually. Infrastructure hardened. Evacuation models updated dynamically. Civilian density around his known locations dropped faster each time he appeared. He wasn't being hunted. He was being starved of impact. Homelander tried to force relevance one last time. He chose a symbolic location, Vought Tower, the place where his myth had been built. He landed atop it as cameras rolled, expecting defiance, chaos, something. The building was empty. Vought had evacuated days earlier. No press, no executives, no resistance. Just a hollow monument to something that no longer existed. Homelander screamed. Not a speech, not a threat. A raw, wordless release of frustration that shattered glass for miles. He wanted a response. He got one. From the sky, something shifted, not physically but perceptually. The pressure Homelander felt wasn't force, it was certainty. The kind that doesn't rush, doesn't escalate, and doesn't negotiate. Whis stepped into view. Not dramatically, not descending with power. He simply was there. Homelander froze. Every instinct screamed at him to attack, to assert, to dominate, but none of it mattered. Whis wasn't an opponent. He wasn't even a participant. He was a witness. You were remembered, Whis said calmly, his tone polite, almost gentle. Just not how you hoped. Homelander's voice cracked. You can't just let this happen. Whis tilted his head slightly. I didn't cause it. That truth landed harder than any blow. Whis explained nothing else. He didn't need to. Homelander finally understood what Beerus had represented, what Whis embodied. Gods didn't end worlds out of anger. They observed until worlds decided. And the world had decided. Whis vanished. No explosion, no flash. Just absence. Within hours, the final measures were enacted. A coordinated, layered response unlike anything ever attempted. Not a single weapon, not a single hero, but everything at once. Suppression fields, environmental manipulation, directed containment zones designed not to kill, but to remove Homelander from relevance permanently. The battle never happened, because Homelander was never given one. Every time he tried to engage, the world shifted, areas emptied, signals vanished, targets dissolved into protocol. He could destroy structures, but no one watched. He could threaten, but no one listened. Finally, exhausted, screaming into a world that refused to respond, Homelander was isolated. Not imprisoned. Neutralized. Contained in a reality where his power could no longer shape meaning. The official language avoided words like execution or death. Instead, they used one phrase consistently. Decommissioned. The world moved on. Crime didn't vanish, evil didn't disappear, but systems held. Sups operated within limits. Fear lost its currency. And somewhere beyond time, Whis recorded the outcome without emotion. A god was not slain. He was rendered unnecessary. And that, across all universes, was the most final ending of all. Decisive outcome ACHAVD. Homelander survives, but stripped permanently of relevance, narrative power, and influence. Vought collapses entirely. The world restructures itself without God figures. Divine observers depart, leaving humanity to live with the consequences. The world does not return to normal. It becomes something smaller, quieter, and far more dangerous for anyone who mistakes power for meaning.